At dawn on the 1st of November 1944, gray light slid over the flooded fields and dunes of Walcheren Island as men of the German 70th Infantry Division waited inside bunkers facing the North Sea. Wind drove spray and sand against rusting wire while, underground, the air smelled of damp wool and cordite. But veterans said the thick concrete and buried 150mm and 88mm guns had already survived weeks of Allied bombing and naval fire. Walcheren, they believed, was the cork in the bottle of Antwerp, and as long as the coastal batteries held, any British or Canadian landing would die on the beaches. Shortly after 0900 hours, observers near West Capelle picked out familiar shapes in the haze, landing craft edging toward the shore with destroyers and monitors forming a gun line beyond. Gun crews swung their barrels and checked range tables and movements that felt almost routine, until one NCO, peering through a periscope slit, saw something that did not belong to any drill. Behind the foremost ships, low silhouettes suddenly spat long, thin white trails in a single, tightly timed burst as naval rocket craft and shore launchers loosed their first salvo. The horizon seemed to flare open as hundreds of streaks of fire arced upward, from racks laid flat along decks and shoreline, and a heartbeat later the dunes in front of the seawall disappeared in a hammering wall of explosions that tore into wire, minefields and machine gun nests that had shrugged off previous bombardments. As bunkers shook, dust poured from ceilings and telephone lines died in men's hands. Defenders who had felt secure understood that their positions were being erased in seconds, and German officers realized that the battle for Walcheren was beginning under a new kind of Allied firepower that would shape everything that followed along Europe's western edge. By early autumn 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had begun to outrun its own lifelines, and nowhere was this more visible than along the cold, tidal waterways of the Scheldt Estuary. Although British forces captured Antwerp on the 4th of September with its port facilities largely intact, the city itself was a hollow prize as long as the estuary remained sealed by German positions entrenched on Walcheren Island, South Beveland, and the Breskens Pocket on the southern bank. These fortified zones overlooked the narrow maritime channels with 150mm, 105mm, and 88mm guns sighted in deep concrete casemates, and as long as they remained operational, not a single Allied supply ship could reach the docks that Montgomery and Eisenhower desperately needed to sustain the drive into the Ruhr. The longer Antwerp stayed closed, the more Allied armies were forced to drag fuel and ammunition over hundreds of kilometers of crowded roads, creating shortages that stalled momentum and exposed the entire front to operational risk. Repeated Allied attempts throughout September and early October to reduce the coastal batteries through air raids and naval bombardment had demonstrated the scale of the problem. Heavy bombers cracked roofs and peeled away camouflage netting. Yet reconnaissance photographs repeatedly showed casemates still functional the following morning. German engineers and naval personnel, drawing on years of Atlantic Wall experience, proved adept at rebuilding collapsed embrasures, rewiring fire control posts, and restoring range-finding equipment overnight. The Breskens Pocket in particular absorbed thousands of shells and remained capable of firing across the estuary day after day. Canadian commanders understood that an amphibious assault under these conditions would demand more than the accustomed pre-landing shelling. It required overwhelming, precisely timed suppression capable of crushing fortified positions at the exact moment assault troops approached the shoreline. This tactical need intersected with an ordnance opportunity unfolding in Britain. Large stockpiles of 3-inch naval rockets, once intended for anti-aircraft barrages, were now obsolete against the diminishing Luftwaffe threat. Their solid warheads, however, were ideal for demolishing bunkers and trench systems if delivered in mass volleys. British ordnance officers began experimenting with simple, ground-mounted tubular frames designed to fire dozens of these surplus rockets simultaneously. Reports from trials suggested that a concentrated salvo could blanket an area with high explosive force in seconds, producing an effect no conventional battery could match. As 1st Canadian Army refined its plan to clear the Scheldt in October, this improvised launcher soon formalized as the Land Mattress was pushed from theoretical curiosity to urgent operational requirement. In a campaign defined by mud, tides, and concrete, the Allies were now preparing a weapon intended to break the stalemate and unlock Antwerp's dormant promise, setting the foundation for the next step in the struggle for the estuary. The Land Mattress emerged as one of the most straightforward yet devastating weapons fielded by the Western Allies in 1944, a system built not from exotic innovation, but from the clever repurposing of existing naval technology. At its heart stood a rectangular steel frame mounting 30 launch tubes, typically arranged in 3 rows of 10, each tube little more than a sturdy conduit for a rocket originally designed for Royal Navy anti-aircraft barrages. These 3-inch rockets, adapted from the unrotated projectile series, carried high explosive warheads weighing several kilograms. Their casings packed to deliver both blast and dense fragmentation, ideal for shredding trenches, wire entanglements, embrasures, and lightly reinforced concrete. The rockets were unguided and inherently imprecise on the level of a single shot, but the Land Mattress compensated for this through sheer volume. With an effective range of roughly 7,000 to 8,000 yards depending on the elevation angle, rockets could be hurled far beyond the forward line of troops, reaching deep into defensive belts or striking obstacles along beaches and dikes, where infantry would shortly advance. The launcher itself was mounted on a robust carriage that could be towed by trucks, universal carriers, or similar vehicles, allowing crews to set up behind dunes, levees, or embankments with minimal preparation. Once emplaced, a small team connected the firing leads to an electrical control box that allowed the full 30-round cluster to be launched in rapid succession or as a near-simultaneous salvo. When several launchers fired together, an arrangement typical of a full battery, hundreds of rockets could be sent into a target area in under a minute, saturating the ground with overlapping impacts that produce shock rather than accuracy. Reports from early field trials emphasized the psychological effect as much as the physical. The rapid shriek of rockets in flight, followed by a rolling, continuous detonation pattern, created a sense of inescapable destruction akin to the notorious German Nebelwerfer, but delivered on a far broader scale. Despite its terrifying effect, the Land Mattress remained an economical solution at a time when demand for artillery ammunition strained allied logistics. Dozens of tubes could be fabricated rapidly, and the rockets themselves were drawn from surplus naval stocks that no longer served a critical air defense role in 1944. Light enough to be shifted quickly after firing, the launchers allowed crews to avoid predictable patterns that German counter-battery units could exploit. For Allied commanders preparing to breach the layered fortifications of the Scheldt Estuary, the Land Mattress offered a timely blend of range, mobility, and raw destructive power, promising to carve open defensive lines that had resisted more conventional methods. The Land Mattress entered combat for the first time in October 1944, when Canadian forces moved to crush the Breskens pocket on the southern bank of the Scheldt Estuary, a stubborn, waterlogged stronghold held by elements of the German 64th Infantry Division. The terrain was among the most treacherous any Allied formation faced that autumn. Flooded polders stretched out like shallow inland seas. Narrow dikes carried the only passable routes forward, and every elevated roadway was raked by interlocking German machine gun and mortar fire. Conventional artillery was difficult to employ without endangering advancing infantry, because even slight miscalculations landed rounds on raised causeways, where assault companies had no room to disperse. Commanders of 1st Canadian Army, forced to fight for each farmhouse and bunker along the sodden approaches, recognized that a new form of suppressive fire was needed, one capable of overwhelming German positions in the moments before infantry moved in. It was in this bleak landscape that Land Mattress batteries were first hauled into firing positions, under Canadian operational control and supported by British technical personnel. The launch frames were emplaced behind dikes and embankments, their 30 tubes elevated toward German-held ridges and trenches. When firing orders were transmitted, the effect shattered the grim monotony of the estuary battlefield. Rockets blasted away from the launchers in rapid burst, each departure leaving behind a thick coil of smoke that drifted low over the wetlands. German sentries who had grown accustomed to intermittent shells suddenly found entire sections of the dike erupting in simultaneous detonations, as dozens of rockets struck in overlapping patterns. Survivors of the barrage later recalled the uncanny sensation that the whole dike lifted as entrenched machine gun posts were torn apart before crews could even emerge from their shelters. This unprecedented concentration of fire allowed Canadian infantry to press forward under a protective curtain of shock and destruction, taking positions that previously demanded prolonged bombardment and costly assaults. Field reports from Breskens quickly circulated among headquarters staffs, affirming that the Land Mattress had filled a critical tactical gap and could be trusted in larger, more complex operations still to come. With the future utility of Antwerp hanging on control of the Scheldt, the weapon's success in the Breskens pocket ensured its inclusion in planning for the assault on Walcheren Island, where even stronger German fortifications awaited. German reactions to the first Land Mattress bombardments were defined above all by uncertainty. In the opening days of October 1944, as Canadian forces compressed the Breskens pocket, frontline observers inside the 64th Infantry Division struggled to explain a form of fire that did not resemble naval gunfire, heavy howitzers, or even the familiar scream of Allied rocket-firing aircraft. The earliest reports that reached battalion command posts described a sudden storm of explosions, without warning, a pattern so dense that individual impacts blurred into a single continuous detonation. Machine gun crews on the dikes near Hoofdplaat reported seeing no shell splashes offshore, and hearing no gun flashes from the usual Allied artillery positions. One coastal observation post submitted a bewildered note claiming that the ground itself seemed to erupt, a phrasing later echoed in multiple company-level diaries, because the impacts fell in tightly clustered intervals. Many defenders concluded that the Allies had deployed a large-scale counterpart to the German Nebelwerfer, a comparison that carried its own irony. Some believed the fire was shipborne, perhaps an evolution of the rocket rails occasionally used by British landing craft earlier in the war. Others insisted it must be a new land-based system, since several bombardments during the Breskens fighting appeared to originate inland, rather than from the Scheldt's waters. These conflicting impressions carried over to Walcheren Island, where observers near Westkapelle in late October reported rockets arriving from two directions. At once one streamed from the sea, another from the distant dunes, making it nearly impossible to determine where Allied launchers were actually sighted. Intelligence officers within the 15th Army attempted to impose order on the chaos. Their internal assessments suggested that British engineers had repurposed naval barrage rockets as a form of shore bombardment, though no consensus existed regarding the launcher's size, crew requirements, or mobility. Counter-battery teams struggled to respond. Land Mattress batteries fired their salvos in seconds and displaced almost immediately, leaving no stable signatures for German sound-ranging equipment to track. As the association between these rocket barrages and imminent infantry assaults became more apparent, German morale assessments recorded a rising sense of dread among garrisons along the Dutch coast. Defenders who had trusted their concrete casemates and meticulously prepared dike positions now faced the unnerving possibility that entire sections of their defensive lines could be erased before a single Allied rifleman appeared. These early, confused impressions underscored the psychological power of the Land Mattress even before its full effect was demonstrated during the climactic battle for Walcheren by mid-1944. The Land Mattress owed its existence not to an ambitious weapons program, but to the sheer practicality with which the British and Canadians turned dormant stockpiles into battlefield strength. For years, the Royal Navy had accumulated tens of thousands of 3-inch unrotated projectile simple, fin-stabilized rockets originally intended to throw barrages of aerial obstacles into the path of enemy aircraft. As the Luftwaffe waned and radar-guided air defense advanced, these rockets slipped into obsolescence. They filled depots and magazines across Britain, too crude for modern naval needs yet too valuable to discard. It was this overlooked reserve that ordnance engineers seized upon, refitting warheads and fuses so the projectiles could deliver a reliable high-explosive blast against fortifications rather than aircraft. The launcher itself reflected the same utilitarian approach, constructed from steel girders, tubular supports, and a straightforward electrical ignition system. The frame could be fabricated in British industrial workshops or assembled in Canadian engineering depots with minimal specialized tooling. Carriages were shipped to the continent in manageable pieces, bolted together near the front, and attached to standard towing vehicles already available in artillery units. Because each rocket provided its own propulsion, there was no recoil mechanism to maintain, and no complex breech systems to manufacture, an enormous advantage at a time when heavy artillery, barrels, and precision machine components were in short supply to sustain operations. First Canadian Army established dedicated rocket parks behind the Scheldt sector. Here, surplus naval rounds were inspected, fuse settings were standardized, and ammunition was stacked in sheltered rows ready for transport to forward batteries. Teams of artillerymen, many of whom had trained on conventional guns, needed only a short conversion course to master the Land Mattress's firing procedures. The logistical burden lay chiefly in moving the vast quantities of rockets required for each operation, a challenge mitigated by the weapon's low cost and the Allies' flourishing supply networks through Belgium. By late autumn 1944, this streamlined production and training system ensured that multiple rocket batteries could support simultaneous operations from the muddy approaches of the Scheldt to the forested frontier of the Reichswald, allowing the Land Mattress to become a mobile, economical hammer accompanying the Allied push toward the Rhine. The assault on Walcheren Island in early November 1944 became the defining demonstration of the Land Mattress's destructive potential, a moment when the weapon proved not only its tactical value but its strategic importance to the entire Allied campaign in the West. Walcheren had been transformed by years of German construction into a coastal fortress bristling with 150 88mm batteries, interlinked bunkers, anti-aircraft towers, and hardened trench systems that guarded the entrance to the Scheldt. Even after RAF bombing raids had deliberately breached the dikes and flooded most of the island, the surviving garrison, drawn largely from the German 70th Infantry Division, regrouped on the remaining high ground, turning roads, dunes, and sea walls into elevated defensive islands amid a drowned landscape. Any force attempting a landing would face the full weight of these positions, many of which had survived repeated naval and air attacks. In preparation for the amphibious assaults at Westkapelle and Vlissingen, Land Mattress batteries were towed into concealed positions behind dunes and berms, their 30-tube frames angled high above the battered coastline. At first light on the 1st of November 1944, just as British and Canadian assault craft pushed toward the shore, the rocket batteries delivered their heaviest coordinated salvo yet. Hundreds of projectiles streaked across the short stretch of water and slammed into the coastal belt. In a rapid, overlapping cascade, barbed wire, minefields, and trenches, features that had remained functional despite weeks of bombardment, were torn open in moments. German machine gun emplacements along the seawall, many of which had survived the blast waves of battleships' guns, collapsed under the concussive force of massed rocket fire. Signals posts attempting to relay information to coastal batteries found their lines cut again and again, each attempt drowned in the thunder of detonations that rolled inland like a physical shockwave. As the landing forces pushed deeper into the flooded island over the next several days, the Land Mattress remained in near constant use, with infantry forced to advance along narrow causeways where there was no room to disperse. Rocket salvos were employed to rupture concentrations of resistance before each new push. German accounts from Walcheren repeatedly described the sensation of being driven backward by a rolling wall of fire, a phrase reflected in multiple war diaries captured after the battle. Diked-up defenses that had withstood artillery for months became untenable within seconds of a Land Mattress strike, compelling defenders to fall back from positions they had assumed would anchor days, if not weeks, of fighting. The rapid collapse of resistance across the island by early November cleared the last obstacles, preventing Allied supply ships from entering Antwerp, transforming the strategic situation in northwest Europe. The weapon that had begun as a pragmatic improvisation had now proven itself indispensable for breaching fortified coastal positions. Its performance at Walcheren ensured it would accompany Allied forces as they turned toward the German frontier, where river lines, fortified villages, and forest belts would again demand a weapon capable of flattening strongpoints. In the space of a heartbeat, the psychological force of the Land Mattress was often as destructive as its physical effects, a reality that became unmistakable in the flooded fields of the Scheldt and the dark forest of the Reichswald. To German troops already strained by weeks of retreat and bombardment, the first hint of an impending salvo was not the distant thump of guns but a sudden, rising roar as dozens of rockets left their rails simultaneously. Unlike conventional artillery, whose incoming rounds arrived at recognizably spaced intervals, a Land Mattress strike produced a single, surging wave of sound that observers later described as a screaming wall. Rolling across the landscape, the rocket's exhaust created long white trails that cut through the mist, before disappearing into curtains of smoke and erupting flame. Within seconds, trenches, dugouts, and concrete aprons that had long given defenders a sense of security buckled under sheets of overlapping explosions, from men crouched inside casemates or pressed into dike walls. The sensation was less of being targeted than of being consumed by a force that left no pocket of safety. Morale. Reports collected by the German 15th Army during the Scheldt battles noted that apprehensions spiked whenever Allied preparations suggested another rocket bombardment. Units that had once held firm under naval gunfire now reported a loss of confidence in fixed positions, a telling phrase for formations trained to rely on concrete and reinforced earth. In the Reichswald in early 1945, soldiers emerging after a salvo found entire sections of woodland stripped bare, root systems torn from the soil, and communication trenches obliterated, reinforcing the sense that no amount of preparation could withstand repeated attacks. As the association between rocket fire and imminent ground assault solidified, some positions collapsed more quickly than expected, not because casualties were overwhelming, but because the defenders felt the line itself had disintegrated. For Allied infantry, the effect was the mirror opposite. Canadian and British troops who advanced behind Land Mattress barrages spoke of a surge of confidence, a visible reminder that the weight of industry and firepower was behind them. The upward flash of 30 simultaneous launches became a kind of signal flare announcing that the next strong point would not have long to resist. Soldiers described watching entire enemy positions vanish into smoke and debris before they even reached their forming up points, a spectacle that reinforced the belief that the German defenses were crumbling. before the weight of Allied technology. This widening psychological gap, fear and resignation among German defenders, steadiness and assurance among Allied attackers accelerated the collapse of several defensive sectors. During the late months of 1944 and early 1945, as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, the Land Mattress added yet another layer to the sense of inevitability, pressing on exhausted frontline units. Its salvos not only broke apart bunkers and trenches but eroded the will to stand behind them, helping to usher in the final Allied advance toward the Rhine. By early 1945, the Land Mattress had moved far beyond its origins along the Scheldt, and was now embedded in the evolving operational rhythm of the British and Canadian armies. As they confronted Germany's western defenses, its next major proving ground came during Operation Veritable, launched in February in the sodden, forest-choked expanse of the Reichswald. Here, the Anglo-Canadian assault met a landscape engineered to halt them, dense stands of timber that masked movement, roads reduced to axle-deep mud, and a chain of fortified villages Cleve, Kranenburg, Gok anchored by bunkers and embrasured farmhouses that controlled the approaches. Conventional artillery struggled to adapt. Trees absorbed shrapnel, shells burst prematurely in branches, and narrow fire corridors made rapid shifts of target risky. The Land Mattress, however, could blanket a swath of woodland or a village edge in seconds, exploiting its saturation effect rather than precision. Batteries were positioned behind dikes, on raised roads, or in clearings carved by engineer teams. Once intelligence pinpointed a suspected assembly point for German reserves or a bunker cluster, holding up in advance, salvo orders were issued with almost no delay. As Veritable gave way to Operation Blockbuster, the rockets again proved indispensable. German counterattacks, often launched by hastily assembled Kampftruppen, could be disrupted before they formed by firing a concentrated barrage across their most likely staging areas. In several instances recorded by Canadian Corps headquarters, rocket salvos shattered counterattack preparations so completely that the defenders abandoned the attempt. When the front pushed toward the Rhine, the terrain shifted to raised embankments, levees, and river approaches that offered commanding defensive positions to German troops. Land Mattress units were used to scour these elevated lines, tearing apart machine gun nests and demolishing hastily built firing points before infantry and armor attempted crossings. During the preparatory stages of Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing offensive in March, the weapon again demonstrated its versatility by neutralizing pockets of resistance on the river's far bank that conventional guns struggled to reach through mist, smoke, and the broken channels of the floodplain. Strategically, these operations revealed the broader significance of the Land Mattress. The opening of Antwerp in late 1944 had transformed Allied logistics, but maintaining momentum through the winter depended on breaking successive German defensive belts before they could stiffen. Rocket-assisted assaults allowed British and Canadian commanders to suppress strong points in minutes, rather than hours, reducing the pauses normally required for artillery preparation. This ability to maintain tempo to keep German formations reacting rather than organizing played a crucial role as the Western Allies approached the Rhine, the last major natural barrier before the heartland of Germany. In this way, the Land Mattress evolved from a solution to a specific estuary problem into a general-purpose breakthrough weapon, one that joined heavy bombers, field artillery, and mechanized spearheads in eroding Germany's capacity for coordinated resistance. As the war neared its end, the Land Mattress, for all its dramatic battlefield influence, remained a weapon shaped by the circumstances of its creation, a powerful instrument, with clear constraints that determined where it could be used to best effect. Although far simpler than heavy artillery pieces, the launcher assemblies were still bulky structures of welded steel tubes and girders that required towing vehicles and relatively stable ground for emplacement. In fast-moving operations or rugged, broken terrain, this bulk limited their mobility. Even when roads were available, winter mud or narrow dikes often slowed deployment, forcing units to plan firing sites well in advance rather than shifting positions on the fly. Once in place, each salvo demanded careful alignment and electrical preparation, making the system less responsive than mobile gun batteries that could traverse and fire within seconds. The rockets, themselves designed originally for naval anti-aircraft barrages, were never intended for precision work on land. Their dispersion pattern, a tolerable drawback when used for area saturation, made them unsuited for striking point targets such as isolated pillboxes, command post, or artillery positions hidden behind specific defiladas. Commanders quickly learned that the Land Mattress could devastate a defensive belt, but could not replace traditional artillery for tasks requiring accuracy. Its dramatic launch signature added another limitation. Each salvo produced thick smoke, bright flashes, and a distinctive roar, making batteries instantly visible to German observers. If a unit remained in one location for more than a few minutes after firing, it risked absorbing counter-battery fire from mortars or field guns. Crews adapted by choosing concealed sites behind dikes and side orchard lines, along forest edges, and rehearsing rapid displacement drills that enabled them to move out as soon as the last rocket left the rails. Ammunition consumption also imposed strategic constraints. A major bombardment could expend dozens of crates of rockets in a single minute, straining supply lines already burdened by winter conditions and the demands of continuous offensives. To avoid depleting stocks prematurely, senior commanders reserved rocket fire for moments of maximum tactical payoff. The opening strokes of an assault on fortified lines, the disruption of detected German counterattack formations, and the preparatory phases of set-piece offensives such as Veritable and Plunder. Used this way, the Land Mattress became an enhancer rather than a replacement instrument for breaking the enemy's grip at key points, while field guns and armor provided sustained pressure afterward.